The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor instantly transformed Robert C. Dick's youthful enlistment into a grim commitment. The War Department's order freezing all enlistments solidified his fate for the duration plus 6 months. The adventure was over. The war was now simply the job. This early service was a proving ground defined by the chasm between military regulations and common sense. Dick learned quickly that the most dangerous enemy was often the bureaucracy itself. This lesson was solidified by his refusal of a colonel's order at Camp Roberts. It was a necessary defiance that established his chain of command. It also earned him the enduring scrutiny of his superiors. This clash of wills reached a dramatic climax at Sudden Tunnel. When PFC George Hill began suffering the excruciating pain of appendicitis, Dick understood that delay meant death. Disregarding every regulation concerning the movement of materiel, he placed railroad torpedoes on the track. The explosive crack of the detonators brought an approaching troop train screeching to a halt. This was followed immediately by the arrival of an enraged colonel, summoned by the flagrant violation of protocol. Dick stood his ground, explaining his desperate measure to save a soldier's life. Though the colonel warned him with fury that troop trains were sacrosanct and could not be stopped, the immediate crisis was averted. Hill was saved, leaving the colonel to exit the platform with an exasperated huff. His figure disappeared into the omnipresent mud. To survive the tedium and poor treatment of early camp life, ingenuity was paramount. Frustrated with the meager rations, Dick spearheaded a pragmatic negotiation with the camp's Chinese cook, who. This established a brief golden age where the soldiers enjoyed surprisingly good meals. It was a small victory of resourcefulness over military standardization. This knack for adaptation and leadership led to his promotion to sergeant. Yet, even in this new capacity, absurdity reigned. This was perfectly illustrated when Dick managed to get his finger firmly wedged in a bayonet. This bizarre predicament required the intervention of Lieutenant Phillips. Phillips wryly noted the ridiculousness of the situation while using shaving soap to free his resourceful, if accident-prone, sergeant. The path to combat was suddenly and violently rerouted. While driving a jeep in a heavy downpour, visibility plummeted to zero. The inevitable happened. A collision with a cow left the front of the vehicle smeared with blood and fur. Dick was left with painful knee injuries. This accident, a consequence of inexperience and poor conditions, was his reprieve. The injury, though painful, led him out of the grueling infantry marches and into the sick bay. There he met Jack Harley, a tank driver. Driven by a desire for combat but needing a non-marching role, Dick requested a transfer to a tank unit. He accepted a demotion back to private. This was a small price for escaping the mud and the endless miles of hiking. He found himself the immediate outsider. He was a Californian dropped into a Southern company, a Hatfield dropped into the midst of a family of McCoys. Dick struggled to decipher their rapid dialect while learning the terrifying complexities of the M3 Stuart light tank. The operational quirks of these 13-ton machines were numerous and frightening. The Guiberson diesel engine required a bizarre ritual of draining oil and hand-cranking with starter shells. The absence of actual brakes meant stopping was a double-clutching, downshifting nightmare. The war effort demanded a constant influx of manpower. This meant the cadre, including Dick, was tasked with training new recruits. The army established a basic training unit to assimilate a large draft of almost entirely Navajo Indians. This new challenge forced Dick, despite his desire for the front lines, to cycle through basic training again. Though initially viewing them as looking like a bunch of Indians, the shared experience quickly forged a deep camaraderie. Lieutenant Phillips, recognizing Dick's leadership, promoted him back to sergeant. Anticipation mounted as rumors spread of deployment to the cold, desolate theaters of Alaska. But the cadre received secret orders to rejoin their outfit. This led them, much to Dick and Philip's delight, not to the snow, but to the tropical heat of Hawaii. It was a clandestine fulfillment of a wish Phillips had secretly expressed. He had painted tropical scenes of palm trees and hula girls on his footlocker back in Olympia. It was a small, defiant act of imagination against the grim reality of war. Life in Hawaii was a study in contrasts. The paradise was marred by the constant filth of coal-burning locomotives. These locomotives spewed the blackest, stinkiest, most choking smoke, covering the soldiers in grease and soot. Suspicion was pervasive, fueled by the recent arrest of Japanese-American fishermen. The tedium of training was punctuated by dangerous laxity. This was demonstrated at South Point, where the relentless wind blew with a vengeance. Dick and Lieutenant Floyd Hammond missed an alert. This led to a tense confrontation with a colonel who had to wake Hammond himself. These early years were a paradoxical mix of extreme danger and debilitating boredom. They were marked by bureaucratic incompetence and individual heroism. Dick's journey, marked by insubordination, ingenuity, and a painful injury, had stripped him of his infantry identity. It had thrust him into the armoured corps, ready for the next, more lethal phase of the war. The transition from the small M3 Stuart to the immense M4 Sherman composite tank marked a terrifying evolution for the armoured corps. These 30-ton behemoths, now armed with a powerful 75mm cannon, were a quantum leap in capability. But they introduced a fatal flaw. Unlike the diesel Stuarts, the new Shermans ran on aviation gasoline. Their Continental radial aircraft engines consumed a staggering 3 gallons per mile. This reliance on high-octane fuel immediately earned them the nickname Romsons among the crews. The name referred to the popular cigarette lighter because a single well-placed shot could turn the tank into a pressurized, burning coffin. The new equipment, while technologically superior, was a bureaucratic nightmare of flawed design. The crew intercom system, a necessity in the deafening confines of the engine compartment, featured new microphones. These were so poorly fitted they made soldiers look like Adolf Hitler with the strap pulled tight across their face. The earphones, designed like painful stethoscope-like instruments, caused immediate discomfort. This led many crews to quickly scavenge older, less standardized gear. Even the driver's seat was a source of constant physical misery. It was padded with stiff springs instead of cushioning, transforming a day's drive into an agonizing battle against the seat. Yet, the tank was their new home. The crews, including Dick, gunner Jim Anderson, and assistant driver Roy Greenup, began the arduous process of adaptation. They learned to slip the clutch and start the heavy vehicle in second gear, because first was simply too slow. The pressure cooker of military life, even before the first shot was fired in anger, was already fracturing some men. Dick witnessed firsthand the psychological toll. Private Don Weller, a comrade, began exhibiting bizarre, uncontrollable behavior. He was counting money relentlessly and barking like a dog. It was a clear, desperate sign of a mind breaking under the relentless strain. This forced a medical discharge hearing where Dick was called to testify about his comrade's unraveling. Similarly, he testified on behalf of Private Fred Camp, who struggled openly with a debilitating drinking problem. These were the invisible casualties of the war. These were men whose nerves had frayed before they even saw the enemy. The training shifted abruptly from mechanics to survival. The unit was plunged into 2 weeks of jungle combat training school. It was a jarring and frustrating environment marked by relentless rain. The instructors were not inclined to smile. The men were paired into tiger teams. A designation Dick found highly amusing. He felt they were far more like kitty cats. The curriculum was brutal and visceral. During demolitions class, a sergeant demonstrated the terrifying potential of Composition C. He shaped the high-explosive putty into a charge before detonating it. The greenhorns watched, unnerved, as live explosives were subsequently detonated in the water. This caused disorienting splashes and hammered home the sheer destructive power they would soon wield. Dick, already a seasoned soldier, still found himself tested physically. During an exercise, he was struck by a sandbag and tumbled into a ravine. This led to a defiant outburst born of pure frustration. To cope with the isolation and the blandness of garrison life, he and his comrades engineered a small rebellion of taste. They schemed to mix precious, hoarded Coca-Cola syrup with water for a fleeting sweet taste of home. Graduation from jungle school meant the intense waiting game began. The focus shifted entirely to deployment preparations, marked by rigorous inspections of every bolt and component of the new Shermans. 82 tanks were lined up for a grand review. It was an immense spectacle fueled by rumors of an imminent move. The anticipation peaked when President Franklin Roosevelt, whom the soldiers glimpsed briefly in a wheelchair, came to inspect the line. It was an anticlimactic event, given the elaborate setup. It was a quick flash of the commander-in-chief that felt strangely distant from their reality. The waiting was filled with dark, necessary humor. At the PX beer shack, the men, knowing a grenade was inert, staged a theatrical panic. This created a hilarious scene of chaos for a hapless military police officer. The joke served as a vital release valve for the mounting tension. Knowing their time in garrison was short, they pooled their resources. They chipped in for civilian canned goods and more Coca-Cola syrup. They were preparing to transform their tanks into a tracked armored goodwill store or traveling gypsy caravan. The bureaucratic wheels turned slowly but inexorably. The soldiers, having accepted the transfer to the Pacific, were about to embark on the next, most dangerous phase of their journey. They were ready to put their untested armor and their fragile nerves against the realities of a global war. The logistics of war were a chaotic, suffocating introduction to the reality of the Pacific theater. On September 13th, the 383rd Regiment departed Schofield Barracks, heading for Honolulu Harbor. 18 30-ton Shermans, the armored heart of the unit, were meticulously rolled onto 18 landing craft mechanized. They were packed 3 abreast and 6 rows deep inside the vast stern opening maw of the LSD-5. This ship, a floating garage, became a cauldron of noise and exhaust. The roar of 36 diesel engines filled the well deck during every operation. The journey across the Pacific was defined by inter-service friction. The Army Yankees and the Navy crew aboard the LSD-5 clashed constantly. This tension boiled over when they crossed the international date line during a storm. The Navy's King Neptune ceremony was a boisterous, often sadistic ritual. But when the Army attempted their own version, it was met with near mutiny by the soldiers. They felt they were being subjected to unnecessary punishment. The resulting chaos required the intervention of Captain Garner, a lawyer in civilian life. He appeared before his men smeared with axle grease and sawdust. He was a comical figurehead of the absurd collision between military protocol and human endurance. By late September, they reached Eniwetok Island, enduring oppressive heat. The narrator knew instinctively this was only a mild prelude. In early October, the sheer misery escalated at Manus Island in the Admiralty Islands. It was a place whose climate, Dick reflected, made the outskirts of hell feel comfortable. The war against the enemy was secondary to the war against the environment. The constant threat of malaria demanded a rigorous daily atabrine regimen. This was enforced by a strict first sergeant. When the narrator was berated publicly for missing a dose, the relentless pressure of the heat and the bureaucracy snapped his patience. He stood his ground and, in a bold act of insubordination, requested to be busted back to private. He was choosing defiance over being treated like a child. Amidst the stifling heat and the bureaucratic grind, the strategic plan for the Pacific shifted with disorienting speed. Mid-October brought briefings about the planned invasion of Yap. Yap was an island known for its bizarre stone wheels used as currency and its bare-breasted inhabitants. The concept, a baffling simultaneous army and marine assault, was soon rendered moot. The objective was suddenly changed. Yap was bypassed. The focus shifted entirely to late in the Philippines, with October 20th, 1944, set as the target date. The danger of the operation was driven home not by enemy action, but by catastrophic failure during practice drills. In a stark, terrifying demonstration of the fragility of the amphibious assault, a landing craft mechanized carrying a Sherman tank took on water and sank. The sight of the 30-ton behemoth disappearing beneath the waves sent a chill through the men. It was a costly reminder of the potential for failure. It underscored how easily a minor error could become a deadly disaster. The final call came as the invasion fleet neared the Philippines. The announcement, "Tankers man your tanks," delivered the most gut-wrenching feeling the narrator had ever known. It was a paralyzing sense of being loaded for bear and nowhere to go. The landing on October 20th plunged them immediately into the logistical nightmare that defined the Leyte campaign. The roads were a ribbon of mud. Movement was nearly impossible. The unrelenting rain turned every path into a bog. The soldiers quickly transitioned from the grand scale of the invasion to the grim, small-scale reality of survival. They lived on dry K rations. Their living quarters were nothing more than shallow dugouts. The camp was set up in a defensive covered wagon formation. The tension was constant. The fear was a hidden birthmark they carried everywhere. During a midnight work detail, a moment of profound, if morally ambiguous, relief arrived. The soldiers discovered a stash of canned peaches. This was a luxury unheard of in their rationed existence. They consumed the peaches in secret, finding deep satisfaction in the sweet, forbidden fruit. It was a brief, stolen respite that contrasted sharply with the grim reality of leaving their comrades to assist in the war effort. Beyond the immediate threats of the enemy, the soldiers battled the constant degradation of their equipment. The narrator's Thompson submachine gun, which bore 8 notches carved into its stock for confirmed kills, was discovered to be rusted due to improper cleaning. This resulted in a stern reprimand from Captain Garner. This focus on readiness, however, did not deter the narrator from making a pivotal, career-defining decision. During a promotion board interview, despite demonstrating a thorough understanding of military strategy and the estimate of the situation, he outright refused a commission as an infantry officer. He would not trade his identity as a tanker for a commission he did not want. He chose to remain a sergeant in the armored corps, but the psychological cost of the conflict was mounting. It was transforming the war from an abstract duty to a personal, painful necessity. The news that his high school friend, Joe Mason, had been killed leading a platoon in an ambush struck the narrator with devastating force. The conflict instantly ceased to be a grand adventure and became a distasteful necessity. He realized the widespread grief experienced by families worldwide. He shuddered at the thought of future engagements, acutely aware of the dangers that now faced his remaining friends. The war was no longer about distant glory. It was about survival, inch by bloody inch. The Battle of Okinawa was meant to be the final, crushing blow delivered by the might of the U.S. Navy and Army. On April 1, 1945, the initial landings were almost eerily silent. The massive naval bombardment had expended hundreds of thousands of rounds. Yet, the absence of organized resistance was not a victory. It was a strategic deception. The Japanese Defense Force, estimated at over 60,000 men, had not been neutralized. Instead, they had retreated into a vast, meticulously prepared network of caves and fortifications honeycombing the high ground. These were specifically designed to command the reverse slopes. This meant the immense firepower unleashed by the battleships, cruisers, and destroyers had failed. The ground troops, the infantry, were left to fight a war of attrition, one cave at a time. The initial complacency vanished. It was replaced by the grim realization that the only way forward was through brutal, close-quarters combat. The war became a desperate, primal struggle in the dark, stinking confines of the earth. The cost was immediate and devastating. Platoons that had landed with 5 Sherman tanks were quickly reduced to 2 or 3 operational vehicles. The terrain itself was an implacable enemy. It was steep and slick with persistent rain, turning recovery into a nightmare. This left disabled tanks exposed to rapid-fire Japanese anti-tank guns. To survive, the tankers had to abandon the notion of detached support. Effective tank infantry cooperation was not a suggestion. It was survival. The infantry, the mudsloggers whom the tankers knew had the toughest job of all, became the eyes and ears of the armoured units. They clung to the outside of the Shermans, directing fire via the external telephones. It was an intimate, terrifying partnership, necessary to root out the enemy hidden in spider holes and caves. The danger was pervasive, threatening to consume them from within as well as without. The logistical tail of the operation remained critically vulnerable. When incoming Japanese artillery found its mark at the ammo and fuel dumps, the resulting catastrophe was breathtaking. The night sky was consumed by a surreal, terrifying light show. 55-gallon steel drums of aviation gasoline ignited, exploding like giant skyrockets. The air was thick with the smell of burning fuel and cordite. It was a constant, sickening reminder that their own supply line, their lifeblood, could be instantly vaporized. Yet, even amidst the spectacle of destruction, the most gut-wrenching trauma came from miscalculation. One afternoon, miscommunication and the Shermans' inherently limited field of vision led to a near disaster. The driver's maneuvering, combined with the confusion of the battlefield, resulted in the gunner almost firing directly onto friendly infantry. The horror of that moment underscored the chaos of armoured warfare. It was the immediate, sick realization that they had nearly annihilated their own men. It underscored the thin line between supporting the troops and killing them. The relentless exposure to shelling and the proximity of death frayed the nerves of every man. After 30 straight days on the line, the narrator felt messed up, his fatalistic outlook solidifying into the grim certainty that he too would eventually be hit. This premonition found its agonizing fulfillment during the near-fatal incident involving Tank Number 60. They were engaged when a catastrophic hit, likely from an anti-tank gun, pierced the armor. The Sherman erupted. Trapped inside the burning vehicle, the narrator was enveloped by the acrid, choking smoke and the terrifying immediate heat. He watched in horror as the new commander, Lieutenant Bomax, was instantly overwhelmed by the flames. The narrator and his comrade, Anderson, fought desperately to escape the inferno. They barely pulled themselves free, aided by Sergeant Hoyt Boggs, who rushed into the fire to pull them clear. The loss of Bomax was a profound shock, but the subsequent transfer of Jim Anderson to maintenance felt like a crippling personal abandonment. Anderson was his closest comrade. His removal left the narrator feeling utterly, terrifyingly alone. He had survived the fire, but his psychological defenses had burned away with the tank. His nerves were broken. He found himself standing alone, his Thompson submachine gun still caked with soot from the fire. His mind was consumed by the overwhelming inability to face the tank again. He reached for his pistol. The cold, heavy steel in his hand offered a definitive, silent escape from the screaming exhaustion and the certainty of future engagements. He felt he had betrayed his crew, betrayed the mission, simply by reaching that point of utter despair. In the tense silence suspended between life and death, the survival instinct, primal and undeniable, finally asserted itself. He lowered the weapon, the moment passing, leaving him alive, but irrevocably scarred. There was no time for recovery. Despite his profound internal distress, the narrator was immediately pressed into command of a new Sherman, Tank Number 57. It was a superior M4 model with a powerful Ford Vate engine that had just thrown a track. The absurdity was crushing. The commander, who felt he couldn't go it anymore, was now forced to lead 4 equally keyed up but inexperienced soldiers.